Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. My guest today is Mr. Scott Stewart, who's a former special agent for the Diplomatic Security Service, and he is now the Vice President of Intelligence at Torchstone Global. And today with him, we'll talk about the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, when a group of terrorists parked a bomb truck below the towers, below Tower 1 specifically, in an attempt to make the towers fall. And as we all know, that didn't happen. Thanks for your time, Scott. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on, Leonardo.
Well, would you like, first of all, to introduce yourself, to tell us something about how you guys got involved in the investigation? Because casual viewers would think that the investigation was mostly on the FBI, but you guys had a major role too. So would you like to give us some background?
Yeah, sure. The Diplomatic Security Service has long had a role protecting, U.S. facilities abroad, embassies and consulates. And my office that I was assigned to at that point, it was our counterterrorism investigations branch. Our office had investigated a large number of large bombings overseas, not only those directed against U.S. facilities in places like Beirut, but we had also helped out with other bombings. So, for example, I had an opportunity to travel down to Buenos Aires to help the Argentine government investigate the bombing of the Israeli embassy there. I also traveled down with some colleagues to Bogota, Colombia, to help the Colombian government investigate some of the large vehicle bombings that Pablo Escobar conducted there. So our office had a lot of experience investigating large bombings. And fortunately, at that point in time, the FBI just hadn't investigated as many large bombings as we had.
Okay, so when you got in charge of this investigation, or at least a part of it, the first thing you had to do was assess the crime scene. So what struck you most about the crime scene at the World Trade Center?
Well, obviously was the scope. As you walked into the parking garage and you just looked across the crater and you could just, the expanse of it, and then looking down several stories and you could see, the cars down in the lower levels, you could look up, just the sheer size and scope of the explosion was really mind-boggling. When we think about the size of the device and the power of the device, it really is miraculous that only 6 people were killed in that attack.
Well, you also mentioned before we started this interview that the FBI involved you guys, and that actually, so can you tell us something about how this whole thing started?
Well, yeah. Actually, as a step before that, a few months prior to the bombing, I was actually over in Yemen with a colleague from the FBI explosives, the laboratory, the explosive sections at the FBI lab. And we were actually over there looking at some bombings and a rocket attack that had been conducted against American interests in Yemen. It would be years before we found out that those two things were connected. But certainly we were very interested in kind of this emerging international jihadist movement that we were starting to see. We eventually came to understand that they were, both the result of this, jihadist network. But at that time, in 1993, we didn't understand that the two events were connected at all.
Okay, the investigation started with the finding of a differential, so a piece of the truck, in the debris. And that sparked the lead that took you guys to the attackers. Can you tell us something about how this thing started?
Yeah, actually, the differential was found by kind of a combination of NYPD, bomb techs, but also ATF. And it was actually on a Sunday night when it was found. And that caused a little bit of consternation. The next morning, the FBI was very angry that they had taken it out. Of course, they did everything properly. They photographed it, they diagrammed it, they tagged it, like you would with evidence. So they handled it properly. But the FBI was kind of upset that they did that. Coincidentally, later that day, a huge slab of concrete fell on the area where the differential had been located. So if they hadn't removed it that night, it might have been some time before we would have been able to locate it. But I was there that evening, and one of my colleagues from the ATF lab, we used to work very closely with their explosives technology branch. And one of my ATF colleagues called me over and said, hey, check this out. And certainly as we looked at the differential, you could tell that it had been in intimate contact with the explosives just by how the metal looked. You could see there was something called gas wash on it. And there was a lot of pitting where, basically pieces of superheated particles had kind of gone into the steel, making, little, almost look like craters on the moon, except in this metal. So you could tell it had been, in intimate contact with the explosives. So they thought that was a pretty good lead, and they wanted to pull it, to start looking at the VIN number for it so that they could identify the bomb vehicle. And ultimately, they were able to do that. They traced it to the Ryder truck. And fortunately, they did so quickly because the guy who had rented the truck, Salem, was trying to get his deposit for the truck. He claimed it had been stolen. And he wanted the deposit so that he could flee the country. And fortunately, the task force, Joint Terrorism Task Force that we were working together on this case, they were able to kind of set him up at the Ryder rental place and bust him when he came back to get his deposit. But identifying Salem and linking him to the bomb truck really allowed us to connect him to the cell of individuals who was known to the FBI, known to the authorities, because of their connection to the assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane. So all of a sudden, the lights went on, and hey, it's these guys that were responsible for the bombing, and not somebody else. Up to that point, there were several different theories. Some of us were suspecting, like I personally was suspecting somebody like Hezbollah, because of their use of large bombs and their desire to hit the U.S. Others were talking about Serbian radicals, and the FBI was tracing a whole bunch of leads regarding Serbian radicals. So there were a lot of potential suspects out there. But once Salem was identified, it was a slam dunk. We knew exactly who they were, and we were able to kind of move in pretty quickly and start rounding them up.
And it's good you mentioned the killing of Rabbi Meir Kahane, because people think that this attack was the first one by Al-Qaeda or someone connected to them in the United States, but actually it wasn't, because the first one was the killing of Rabbi Meir Kahane.
Yeah, and that was also kind of a contentious case. My office ended up doing a lot of work on that case because the FBI had declared it was not terrorism. And so the district attorney's office in Manhattan was very frustrated, and they needed help running overseas leads in Egypt on El Said Nosser, the shooter in that case. So my office did a whole bunch of work, running down leads in Egypt, even tracing the weapon used in the attack. To help out the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. So we had also been kind of tangentially, working this crew of people, with the FBI and through the JTTF at that point.
One of the planners of this attack was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who today is very well known for being the mastermind of 9/11. Can you tell us what his role in the planning of the first attack was?
Well, I mean, the big link there, to that 93 attack was the fact that his nephew was one of the two bomb makers that was dispatched from the Al-Qaeda core to go over and help this cell be able to pull off the attack. To walk back just a couple steps, in the wake of the Kahane killing, the FBI had an informant placed within this cell, and he was helping them monitor, their activities. Unfortunately, that ended up being a huge fiasco. The informant was not handled well. He basically started recording his FBI handlers and was handling them, in essence. But at that point, the FBI had also kind of made this assessment that these guys were kind of like the Keystone Cops and really weren't able to, to do much on their own, which ended up being a fairly accurate assessment because, they were supporting actors in the 93 bombing, but it really required the brains to come in from overseas. And one of those guys that came in from overseas was this guy that people know by the name of Ramzi Youssef. And that was actually the name in his fraudulent Iraqi passport. His real name was Abdel Basit Abdel Karim, and he's a Pakistani citizen. He wasn't an Iraqi named Ramzi Youssef, but he indeed is actually Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's nephew. He was kind of dispatched along with another guy who had gone through Al-Qaeda's bomb-making class, a guy by the name of Ahmed Salem. and they traveled together from Afghanistan through Pakistan to New York, and they're the ones that put together the bomb. Now, interestingly enough, Ajaj was nabbed by authorities, immigration authorities, as they were entering the country, and he was found to have a whole suitcase full of bomb-making manuals. He actually was trying to enter the U.S. on a photo-substituted passport, and didn't make it. Now, on the other hand, the guy that we knew as Ramzi Youssef, Abdel, he actually claimed that he had lost his documentation and had claimed asylum. So he was able to kind of be paroled into the country and then make the bomb. Interestingly enough, he had some questions on things. So he ended up actually calling Ajaj, who was in detention, waiting to be deported. And he was asking him questions on how to make the bomb, as these guys were working back and forth together. But they were really the brains of the operation that kind of came together with this kind of, misfit group that was in New York, to put everything together and to really be the brains of the attack. And so, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's role was basically sending Ajaj and his nephew, Abdel over here to ramrod the operation.
Well, another of the famous planners here is a man by the name of Omar Abdel Rahman, better known as the Blind Sheikh. Can you tell us something about what his role in the planning was?
Yeah, the Blind Sheikh there again, he was worked more of an intermediary between kind of the cell here and Al-Qaeda Central. So more of a kind of a communications hub, but also a communications hub. But also he kind of gave the blessing on the targeting. So that was kind of his role, was to kind of provide the religious justification or the religious stamp of approval, declaring that this attack was justified. And that was basically his role within this conspiracy. And subsequently he would be indicted for the follow-on New York City landmarks plot, where he basically played the same sort of role.
Okay, you mentioned something I would like you to elaborate on. This FBI informant by the name of Ahmad Salem, who was totally unreliable, and it's even funny to listen to because he said something like he warned the FBI on time, but they didn't believe me, so they kind of let it happen. Would you like to tell us something more about this person?
Well, no, I mean, Ahmad Salem, he was basically a con man, and he was in it for the money. He was playing all ends, against each other. His claims afterwards were, in some ways legitimate. I mean, he was within that cell, but he certainly didn't know about that bombing. He would later be, reintroduced into the organization. He would then really help with the follow-on plot, the New York bomb plot, as far as getting, the cameras set up and all the recordings and such. But he really was a loose cannon, was very unreliable. And it's not shocking that the FBI cut this guy off as he was a con man. And they've received a lot of heat about it over the years. But in many ways, he was very sophisticated as a con man, and really, in some ways, the agents that were handling him were kind of out of their depth. And to be quite honest, from their perspective, the group in New York and New Jersey, they really were a bunch of goofballs, as we would later see. But I don't think the FBI really counted on these accomplished, trained terrorists coming in from Afghanistan to really pull off that kind of an operation.
But is it common for the FBI to have informants that turn out to be so useless? Because at a certain, it seems
sadly,
like you have to sift through the information you get from these guys.
Yeah, and that's unfortunately it's common across all law enforcement and all intelligence. You always have fabricators. You always have people who are out there, self-promoters. People just trying to make a buck and kind of use the agents themselves. I've seen it numerous times in especially DEA cases regarding terrorist threats. Basically these people would run out of drug information, and they thought, oh, well, what can I get more money from the DEA from? Well, I'll make up something about a terrorist threat. But certainly, the CIA has issues with fabricators and agents they can't control as well. Certainly, we've seen multiple cases where we've had defectors that have undefected just because the CIA was struggling to handle them. So it's not unusual, and of course, it's not just an American problem, right? It happens universally across the world.
What security measures were enacted after this attack?
Yeah, really, one of the things that we saw between this attack and then, of course, the Murrah building, the Oklahoma City bombing, we really saw measures enacted to make it more difficult to get explosives or precursor chemicals to manufacture explosives in large quantities. And so not only did we have, efforts to educate suppliers, chemical supply companies and other things to basically understand what illegitimate, bomb making activity looks like. So really, when we look at it, since that time, it's been much, much more difficult for terrorists to get explosives inside the U.S. And that's probably one of the reasons that the 9/11 attackers used the means that they did, right? The MO they did of using the aircraft. They were struggling to get explosives. Even people like the Boston Marathon bombers, et cetera. It's just very, very difficult to get explosives, more difficult than it was in 1993.
Do you think there's a common thread between this attack and 9/11? What I mean here is, did the terrorists strike the World Trade Center twice, like with a sense of retaliation, or was the second attack just because the Twin Towers were such a big symbol of the American economy?
I think both of the above, all of the above. I mean, certainly the symbolic importance is definitely there, and really what we saw on 9/11, they were going after America's military symbol of the Pentagon. We saw them going after the economic symbol of the Trade Center, and then the political symbol if they're going after the Capitol. So they were kind of trying to hit all three, major symbols of American power there on that attack. But certainly, I do believe that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed specifically thought that they had some unfinished business with the Trade Center. And despite the size of that device, and I mean, it's hard to understand how much damage was done down in that basement, but how little damage it actually did to the structure. You know what I mean? It was a huge device, caused this huge crater through these giant these giant iron beams and stuff, meters. But it never really shook, the buildings. And it certainly didn't topple them. So I think that they felt that there was unfinished business there. And that was certainly one of the motives of the 9/11 attacks.
Well, actually, the towers were very well built because they also withstood an airplane crash for almost 2 hours. So that's sustaining.
Yeah, it's amazing. And there again, that was one of the things that just totally blew my mind when I watched the towers collapse. You know what I mean? It's incomprehensible to me because of what I had seen and the damage done to it in the 93 attacks that barely scratched it. To watch them crumble like that was just shocking.
I agree. It was a shock for the whole world. What lesson did you gain as an investigator from this case?
One of the things that I always, took away from it is just the resourcefulness of terrorist planners to adopt new and novel tactics that kind of have an advanced understanding of our system and ways that they can circumvent current rules and security restrictions, and able to kind of bypass those, and then of course use the system against itself. They used our own aircraft against us as weapons. I think that was a huge paradigm shift. At that time, when I was still with the government, we used to have to go through these mandatory FAA briefings every year because we would travel armed. And, one of the things that the FAA always told us and stressed in those briefings is, don't intervene if there's a hijacking, because, the hijackers are going to land the plane, and then we'll have, the FBI, HRT, or Delta or somebody will come in and take them out. You don't want to be the person starting a firefight at 36,000 feet. That was just the common wisdom. And now that's totally been turned on its head. But it's just interesting to me that they were able to look at the requirements. They were able to look at what weapons were allowed through the screening. So going to the box cutters, and they found out that box cutters could be taken through. And then they figured out how they could use those to commandeer the plane. So I just think the inventiveness of terrorist planners is something that we really need to be aware of and try to anticipate more. And I think we've done a fairly good job of anticipating, those types of paradigm shifts. But certainly, unfortunately, someday we're going to see somebody else pull some other paradigm shift that nobody sees coming.
Of course, because this is how it works. Many thanks for your time, Scott, and many thanks for giving us these very special explanations about an attack that is too often forgotten.
Well, thank you for having me on, Leonardo.
Thanks everybody else for watching this, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.